It begins quietly. A narrow house at the far edge of town, sitting alone against the creeping dark of the fields. The kind of place you drive past without noticing. Curtains always drawn, lights dim even in the early evening. Inside lives Margaret Hensley, 68 years old, a widow for nearly a year. Her husband, Arthur, had been a collector of old things. Clocks, tools, radios that hadn't spoken in decades. He filled shelves with antiques that looked more like ghosts of machines than objects still meant for use. Since his death, Margaret has spoken to almost no one. Neighbors see her sometimes walking to the market, her coat pulled tight, her eyes downcast. They whisper about her solitude, but no one dares visit after dusk. The house feels wrong at night, they say, like it's listening. In the corner of her sitting room sits Arthur's radio. It's heavy and wooden, its surface scarred with scratches from years of tuning. A machine from another age when voices carried across wires instead of screens. Arthur had loved that radio. He kept it polished, even when the tubes inside had long since burned out. Margaret never touched it. It was Arthur's, and now Arthur was gone. Until one night in late November. The clock beside her bed read 1:59 a.m. She woke without knowing why. A prickle on her skin, a sense of being summoned. The house was silent. Then, from the sitting room below, came a faint hum. At exactly 2:00 a.m., the radio crackled to life. Not music, not news, just static, soft and broken, spilling into the stillness of the house. Margaret rose from her bed, each step down the stairs slow, her hand trembling on the banister. She reached the sitting room, and there it was. The radio, unplugged, its cord coiled neatly on the floor, yet the speaker hissed as though it were breathing. She stood frozen. The static deepened, shifted, and for the briefest moment it almost formed words. And a voice, a man's voice. She whispered her husband's name. Arthur? The radio went silent. That was the first night, and not the last. Margaret woke late the next morning, her mind aching as if she had been drinking, though she hadn't touched a drop in years. She told herself it had been a dream, that was all. People dream of their dead loved ones all the time. Dreams of voices, of presences that feel real. It was nothing more. But when she came down the stairs, she saw the radio again, sitting in its corner, unplugged, silent. Her stomach turned. The memory of that static lingered like a taste she couldn't spit out. That afternoon, she went into town. She kept her head down at the grocer's, but as she stood in line, she caught a voice. Strangest thing last night, a man was saying. It was her neighbor, Mr. Collins, a man with a cassette recorder always at hand. He liked to capture late-night broadcasts, shortwave signals drifting across the air. He spoke to the shopkeeper, but Margaret couldn't help listening. My machine caught something I can't explain. Around 2 in the morning. Static, sure, but then... He lowered his voice. Then a man's whisper, clear as day. Gave me chills, it did. Margaret dropped her groceries. That evening, Mr. Collins knocked at her door. He held a tape in his hand. You should hear this, he said quietly. Against her better judgment, she let him in. He set the cassette into his player, pressed play. Static, crackling, a faint hum. Then, a man's voice. Low, strained, almost as if pressed through a wall. I never left. I'm in the walls. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. Her throat went dry. It was Arthur's voice. She knew it as surely as she knew her own. She backed away, whispering, That's impossible. He's dead. Collins ejected the tape, his hand shaking. Then tell me why I caught it at the exact time my recorder always switches tapes. 2 o'clock sharp. And tell me why he said your name before that sentence." Margaret stared at the radio in the corner. Silent, unplugged, but she could feel it. Waiting. Margaret didn't sleep. She sat in her chair by the window, staring at the silent radio. Every tick of the clock made her flinch. Each time the pipes groaned, she held her breath. It wasn't just grief anymore. She had heard his voice, and worse, someone else had heard it too. Arthur's voice. Her Arthur. At 2 a.m., the radio stayed quiet. That almost frightened her more. By morning, she found herself in the attic, opening the old cedar trunk Arthur had left behind. It still smelled faintly of tobacco and dust. Inside, a stack of neatly folded suits, a box of letters tied with string, a small tin where he had kept his fountain pens, and at the very bottom, his will, handwritten in his steady script. Margaret sat on the attic floor, heart pounding, and read. It was ordinary at first, dividing the property, leaving her the house, the antiques, his modest savings, but at the bottom, written almost as a postscript, was a line that made her blood run cold. "If she hears me call, do not let her answer." Her hands shook. She read it again. The words never changed. Arthur had known. He had expected this. The radio hummed faintly below, as if aware of her discovery. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, the will spread before her, the neighbor's tape beside it. She couldn't escape the thought. Why would Arthur warn her not to answer unless he knew something waited for her? The grandfather clock in the hall struck once. 1:59 a.m. Margaret closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "I won't answer. I won't." At exactly 2 o'clock, the radio crackled to life, and this time the voice was clearer. Margaret. She covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. The will's words echoed in her mind like a prayer. Do not let her answer. But every fiber of her wanted to. The next morning, Margaret avoided the sitting room altogether. She closed the door on the radio, locked it, and carried the key in her apron pocket as if that alone might protect her. But the house had grown restless. When she walked the hall, she heard faint creaks behind the wallpaper. Not the usual settling of wood, but shifts, like someone brushing their hands along the plaster from the inside. At first, she told herself it was her imagination. Grief. Isolation. But by evening, she could no longer pretend. As she boiled tea in the kitchen, she saw it. The faintest ripple in the wallpaper above the stove, as though the wall itself were breathing. She dropped the kettle, scalding water spilling across the floor. The ripple stilled. Her heart thudded so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. That night, she slept on the sofa rather than face her bedroom. At 2 a.m., the radio's static returned, muffled by the closed sitting room door. She pressed her hands over her ears, whispering the words from Arthur's will like a prayer. Do not answer. Do not answer. The static deepened. The voice came again, clearer than ever. Margaret, please, let me out. And then, a sound from the wall directly behind her. Knuckles, knocking. 3 slow raps that shook the frame of the house. She fled to the front porch, barefoot, shivering in the winter air. Across the street, Mr. Collins's light was on. He stood at his window, pale, holding his tape recorder. Even from a distance, she saw him shake his head, mouthing words she couldn't hear, but she could read his lips. Don't answer. When she finally crept back inside at dawn, the sitting room door was ajar. The radio sat still, silent, its cord coiled neatly on the floor. But the wallpaper behind it bulged outward, just slightly, as if something inside had pressed its face against it and almost broken through. Margaret lasted 3 nights without speaking. 3 nights of static hissing through the sitting room door at exactly 2:00 a.m. 3 nights of knocks traveling the length of the walls, as though something inside were searching for a way out. 3 nights of whispering her late husband's warning until her throat ached. Don't answer. Don't answer. But grief has a way of carving holes in silence. And loneliness. Loneliness fills them with voices. On the 4th night, she broke. The static rose again at 2:00, louder this time, straining the very air in the house. The voice pressed through. Margaret, please. I never left. Tears blurred her vision. She clutched the will in her trembling hand. Her lips moved before her mind could stop them. Where are you? The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Then came the reply, not faint, not broken, but sharp, close, as if whispered directly into her ear. Here, in the walls, behind you. Margaret spun, her back pressed against the cold plaster. The wallpaper rippled, bulging outward in the shape of a handprint. Fingers splayed. She stumbled back, choking on fear, but the handprint faded before it could break through. All night she sat frozen in the corner, the unplugged radio humming softly, as though satisfied. When morning came, she found something new. A scrap of paper slipped beneath her door, folded once. On it, in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting, were just 3 words. You answered me. The note stayed on the kitchen table all day. Margaret couldn't bring herself to touch it again. It was Arthur's handwriting. She would have sworn to it in court, the careful loops of his R's, the long tail of his Y. But Arthur had been gone a year, buried with that steady hand folded on his chest. By evening, she was shaking so badly she went to Collins's house across the street. He opened the door with hollow eyes. His tape recorder was still running on the table behind him. You heard it again, he said softly, not as a question. Margaret's voice cracked. It was Arthur. But it isn't only him, is it? Collins hesitated, then pressed play. The tape filled the room with static. At first, one voice, Arthur's, low and strained. I never left. Then another, higher, thinner, a woman this time. Help me. Then another, a child's whimper. Then more, voices layering, overlapping, as if dozens of throats pressed against the same wall, all desperate to be heard. Collins shut it off, his hand trembling. It's not just your Arthur, Mrs. Hensley. Something's crowded in there. Something's using his voice to draw you in. Margaret swayed, gripping the chair for balance. But why me? Collins looked down, ashamed. Because you answered. That night she sat in her darkened kitchen, every lamp switched off, praying silence might keep them at bay. But at 2:00 sharp, the radio crackled again. This time the voices came in chorus. Not only Arthur, but countless others, whispering in layers through the static. Join us. Join us. Join us. The wallpaper rippled along every wall of the room, shifting like a tide. Margaret screamed into the empty air. Leave me alone! The radio snapped off. Silence returned. But on the plaster above the unplugged cord, fresh words had appeared, scrawled in ash. Too late. Margaret could stand it no longer. All morning she stared at the hulking wooden radio in the corner, its polished surface gleaming in the weak light. It had belonged to Arthur, yes, but now it was something else entirely. She fetched a hammer from the shed. Her hands trembled, but her jaw set firm. This ends now, she whispered. The first blow splintered the wood. The second cracked the glass dial, shards scattering across the carpet. By the third, the speaker split open with a hollow groan as if the machine itself were sighing. Margaret smashed it until it was nothing but fragments, wood and wire tangled like the ribs of a carcass. She dragged the pieces out back, dumped them into the bin, and stood over them, chest heaving. For the first time in days, she breathed freely. That night, she forced herself to stay awake, certain 2:00 a.m. would come and pass without sound. 1:59. Her heart pounded. 2:00. Silence. Relief washed over her. She laughed softly, half sobbing. It's done. It's over. But in the morning, when she shuffled downstairs, she froze. The radio was back, sitting in its corner, whole, untouched. The glass dial unbroken, the wooden frame unscarred, the cord coiled neatly on the floor. It looked as though it had never been harmed at all. Margaret collapsed into the chair, covering her mouth. On the floor beside the radio lay a scrap of paper, folded once. She opened it with trembling fingers. Arthur's handwriting again. You cannot throw away what is already inside. That night at 2:00 a.m., the radio hummed to life without hesitation. Arthur's voice emerged, steady, coaxing, almost kind. You tried to kill me, Margaret, but I am still here. I am always here. And from inside the wall behind the radio came a soft, steady knocking. Not asking anymore. Answering. By the next morning, Margaret's resolve had crumbled. She hadn't slept. Her hands shook constantly. The note with Arthur's words still sat on the kitchen table, taunting her. She needed help. At noon, she walked into the small police station downtown, clutching the folded scrap of paper like proof. The officer on duty, Sergeant Howard, listened patiently as she spoke. Her words tumbled out in a rush, the static, Arthur's voice, the wall moving, the radio returning whole after she'd destroyed it. Howard didn't laugh. He didn't tell her she was mad. He only frowned, pen still in hand, then said, Mrs. Hensley, are you certain it wasn't a dream? You've been alone a long time. Her voice broke. It's not just me. My neighbor recorded it. You can hear him. Arthur. That gave Howard pause. 2 officers accompanied her home that afternoon. Howard and a younger patrolman named Jacobs. They stepped into the quiet house, their boots heavy against the old floorboards. Margaret pointed toward the sitting room. It happens at 2:00 a.m. Please, stay and hear it for yourself. Howard sighed but agreed. They waited. The clock ticked toward midnight, then 1. The house grew colder, as if holding its breath. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, eyes locked on the silent, whole radio. The officers exchanged looks, shifting in their seats. 1:59. The radio clicked. Static spilled into the room. Howard's pen fell from his hand. Jacobs swore under his breath. The static deepened. Then Arthur's voice, clear as though he were standing in the room with them. Margaret, I never left. I'm in the walls. Jacobs leapt to his feet, flashlight out, scanning the plaster. Howard's face drained of color. But the cord... The younger officer pressed his ear to the wall. His eyes went wide. There's knocking, he whispered. At once, a loud thud shook the plaster, making the picture frames rattle. Margaret covered her mouth, sobbing. Howard stumbled back, fumbling for his radio to call it in. But when he pressed the button, all he got was the same static, the same voice whispering back through the line. At 2:15, the noise stopped. The radio fell silent. The walls stilled. The 2 officers stared at Margaret with something beyond disbelief. Fear. Howard gathered himself, his voice unsteady. We'll file a report. Don't touch that radio, Mrs. Hensley. Do you understand me? Don't touch it." They left quickly, boots pounding down her front steps. Margaret was alone again, and from the kitchen, she heard the faint scrape of paper sliding across the table. Another note. In Arthur's hand, now they've heard too. 2 nights later, the police came back, not with sirens or uniforms, but quietly, after dark, plain clothes, their expressions grim. Sergeant Howard and Officer Jacobs carried a reel-to-reel recorder, a bulky machine with spools of magnetic tape. "We're not filing this one with the department," Howard said as they set it up in Margaret's sitting room. "No one would believe us. But if it happens again, we'll have proof." Margaret only nodded. Her eyes never left the radio in the corner, its silent face gleaming in the dim lamplight. The men prepared the equipment, microphones placed near the radio, tape spooling slowly. They sat in tense silence waiting. 1:58. 1:59. At exactly 2 o'clock a.m., the radio clicked. Static bled into the room, thick and uneven, almost wet. Howard stiffened. Jacobs leaned forward, Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. Then the voice came. Arthur's voice. "Margaret, I am still here." Jacobs whispered, "It's him. God help me. It's him." But the tape recorder captured something more. Through the speakers of the reel-to-reel, the static didn't sound like static anymore. It sounded like movement. Shuffling, scraping, dozens of feet dragging across hollow floors. Breaths layered on breaths, sighing in unison. Howard's face tightened. That's not just one voice. The radio speaker hissed, and a second voice emerged. Not Arthur's, not human. "Closer!" At that moment, the needles on the recorder spiked violently. The reels spun faster than they should, tape rattling across the spools. Jacobs lunged to shut it off, but before his hand touched the button, the sound erupted. From both the radio and the recorder came a scream, long, guttural, tearing through the room as though the walls themselves were shrieking. The lamp shattered. Margaret fell to her knees, covering her ears. Then, silence. The reels spun empty. The radio clicked off. When the officers lifted the tape, they found it blank, smooth, unmarked, as if nothing had been recorded at all. But Margaret saw something else. On the plaster wall just behind the radio, dark letters had appeared, scrawled in soot. "You cannot record what you are inside." Howard swore under his breath, grabbing his coat. "We're done. This isn't evidence. It's a trap." The men fled into the night, leaving Margaret alone with the humming silence. And when she glanced at the tape reels one last time, she swore she saw shadows moving inside the magnetic strip as it spun. The police never came back. Margaret sat alone in the silence of her house, staring at the unplugged radio. She tried not to think of the soot-written message still faint on the plaster. "You cannot record what you are inside." But she didn't need the radio anymore to hear them. It began with the pipes. As she ran water for tea, a murmur threaded through the gurgling stream, a whisper, too low to make out. When she bent closer, it grew sharper. "Margaret." She dropped the kettle, scalding water hissing across the counter. That night, the furnace groaned in the basement. She thought nothing of it, until the sound shaped itself into words. "Let me in." The voice echoed up through the floorboards, vibrating in her bones. By the third day, even her mirrors betrayed her. She caught movement in the glass while combing her hair, not her reflection, but someone standing just behind her shoulder. A man's silhouette, familiar. Arthur. But when she spun, the room was empty. The mirror fogged as if someone had leaned close and breathed against it. Across the glass, 3 words appeared in fading condensation. Answer again. Margaret locked every door, every window. She unplugged the fridge, the lamps, every machine she owned. But the whispers didn't stop. They came from the vents, the tick of the clock, the shuffle of her own slippers across the floor. The entire house was speaking now, and all of it wanted her. That night at 2:00 a.m., the radio joined the chorus. Static roared from the unplugged machine. Arthur's voice rose above the others, louder, pleading, closer. "Margaret, you let me in once. Let me in again." She clutched her husband's will to her chest, rocking in her chair, whispering the line over and over. "Do not answer. Do not answer. Do not answer." But when she looked down, she saw the will's final page had changed. Beneath Arthur's careful signature, new words were scrawled in his hand. "She will answer. She always does." Margaret couldn't stand another night. The whispers seeped through every vent, every pipe, every mirror. Even silence felt full, heavy with listening. On the morning of December 10th, she packed a small suitcase. 2 dresses, her late husband's photograph, and a Bible she hadn't opened in years. She locked the front door behind her, heart pounding with fragile relief. For the first time in weeks, she thought, maybe I'll sleep. She walked down Blackthorn Lane toward the bus stop. The cold winter air burned her lungs, and yet she smiled. The further she went, the smaller the house became behind her. But halfway down the road, she heard it, faint, carried on the wind. "Margaret?" She froze. Her suitcase slipped from her hand. There was no house nearby, no radio, no vent or pipe. Only the empty road, the bare trees, and the whisper curling through the air. She hurried to the bus stop, clutching her coat tight. Another voice rose, layered with the first. Then another. Dozens, weaving through the rustling branches like breath. "Don't go. Stay with us. In the walls. In the air." She pressed her palms to her ears, but the voices bled through bone. When the bus arrived, the driver leaned out, frowning. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Margaret stumbled forward, desperate, reaching the open door. Then she froze. The driver's radio crackled. Static. And from the bus speakers came Arthur's voice, calm and clear. "Sit down, Margaret. Ride home with me." She staggered back, shaking her head violently. No, you're not him." The driver looked at her in confusion. "Who isn't, ma'am?" But the static grew louder, spilling from the bus radio until the driver himself recoiled, slamming the dial. Margaret ran, leaving suitcase and bus behind, back up the frozen road toward her house. The whispers followed her, rising with every step. By the time she reached her front door, the entire sky seemed to breathe with Arthur's voice. "You can't leave me." "You can never leave." She collapsed inside, slamming the door. The house was quiet again, but on the floor beside the radio waited another note. Arthur's hand, neat and careful, spelling 5 words. "The world is my wall." Margaret didn't eat for 2 days. She drifted through her house like a shadow, flinching at every creak of the floorboards, every faint groan of the pipes. The note by the radio still sat where she had found it. "The world is my wall." She tried to burn it, but the flame went out the moment it touched the paper. On the 3rd night, she couldn't stand it anymore. She crossed the street to Collins's house, her coat wrapped tightly against the cold. He opened the door quickly, as if expecting her. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembling. "I've been meaning to come to you," he said. "You need to hear this." In his living room, the tape recorder sat waiting. He pressed play. Static filled the room, thick, uneven, layered with the same suffocating voices. Arthur's voice came first. "Margaret, you let me in." Then others, a chorus of strangers, pleading, whispering, wailing. But then Collins leaned forward, lowering the volume. "Listen carefully here," he murmured. Margaret held her breath, and then she heard it, her own voice, soft, broken, unmistakable. "Where are you?" The words she had spoken to the radio nights ago, captured, preserved, played back to her now as if she were one of them. Her knees buckled. She gripped the arm of Collins's chair to keep from falling. "That's impossible," she whispered. Collins's face was pale. "Margaret, whatever's in those walls, it's not just speaking. It's taking. It's pulling pieces of you inside every time you answer." She shook her head violently. "No, it was just once. Only once." Collins rewound the tape, pressed play again. And this time, her voice was louder, repeated, overlapping itself again and again. "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" Margaret clutched her ears, sobbing. "It isn't me!" Collins's eyes flicked to the wall behind her. The wallpaper bulged just slightly, as though listening. And then the radio in her house across the street crackled to life. They both heard it, even through the walls and the winter night between them. Arthur's voice carried across distance. "She is already answering." Collins arrived at Margaret's house the following evening with an armful of equipment. "If the voices want to be heard," he muttered, "we'll make them prove themselves." He set up 3 tape recorders, one in the kitchen, one in the hall, and one directly beside the radio. He marked the reels carefully, his handwriting neat and meticulous. Margaret sat stiffly in her chair, arms wrapped tight around herself. "It won't matter," she whispered. "They'll only give you what they want you to hear." Collins didn't answer. He only pressed record. The night dragged on, each tick of the clock a hammer against Margaret's ribs. At 2 a.m., the radio clicked to life, static spilling into the room. Arthur's voice came low and familiar. "Margaret, come closer." She clenched her fists, shaking her head. "No, I won't answer again." The walls pulsed once, as though disappointed. The static faded. By 2:15, all was quiet. The next morning, Collins collected the reels and played them back one by one. The kitchen tape, only silence. The hall tape, the faint hum of the furnace. The sitting room tape, static, Arthur's voice, the same words they had heard with their own ears. But then, something new. At 2:07 a.m., the recording shifted. Margaret's voice spoke, soft and steady. "I'll come, just a little closer." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. "No, I never said that. I was sitting here. I didn't—" Collins stopped the tape, staring at her with wide, horrified eyes. "Margaret, I watched you the whole time. You didn't move. You didn't speak." Her voice continued on the tape anyway. "I'll come." Margaret's chest seized with terror. "It's taking me, piece by piece. It's making another me." Collins turned off the machine, his hand shaking. From the corner of the room, the radio crackled faintly, though no one had touched it. And from inside the static, layered beneath Arthur's voice, another voice rose. Margaret's own. "Closer." Margaret barely left her chair for the next 2 days. She refused to speak after 2 a.m., terrified that any sound might be used against her. But silence is no shield when the house itself is listening. On the 3rd night, as she sat alone in the dark, she noticed the wallpaper ripple again, a subtle wave across the plaster near the sitting room corner. At first, she thought it was a trick of her weary eyes, Then the ripple sharpened into a shape, a face pressing outward. Her own. It stared at her through the thin paper, lips moving without sound. Margaret stumbled back, clutching her chest. "No, no, that's not me." The face smiled faintly, and then the whisper came. Not from the radio this time, but from the wall itself, vibrating through the plaster. "I'm almost finished." The face dissolved back into the wallpaper, leaving only faint handprints dragging along the inside of the wall as if retreating into another room. The next morning, Margaret tore at the wallpaper in panic, clawing strips of it away until her fingers bled. Beneath, she found gouges carved directly into the plaster, dozens of them, each one spelling the same word in her own handwriting: Margaret. She staggered to Collins's house, hysterical, dragging one of the scraps of wallpaper behind her. He paled when he saw it. "It's shaping you," he whispered. "Every time you hear it, every time you look at it, it's making another you on the other side." Margaret sobbed, clutching his arm. "Then what happens when it's finished?" Collins looked toward her house across the street. The curtains shifted, though no one was inside. His voice trembled. "Then you won't be needed anymore." That night, she stayed at Collins's insistence. He made up a cot for her in his living room. But at 2:00 a.m., his tape recorder clicked on by itself. And from the speaker came Margaret's voice, but not hers. Smooth, calm, certain. "You can't hide me. I'm already here." That night, Collins insisted she stay. "You're not safe there anymore," he told her, his voice firm. Margaret sat stiffly in his armchair, her shawl pulled tight, eyes fixed on the tape recorder sitting on the coffee table. She hadn't spoken in hours. Collins made tea, his hands shaking as he poured. He was exhausted too, haunted by the sounds he'd captured, by the voices that seeped through tape. At 2:00 a.m., the recorder clicked on by itself. Static filled the room, followed by Arthur's familiar whisper, "Margaret, you belong here." Margaret whimpered, covering her ears. Collins cursed and shut the machine off. But from across the street, through the dark window pane, he noticed something. Her house. The curtains in the sitting room had parted. Collins froze. "Stay here," he told her, though she clung to his arm. Through the gap in the curtains, the faint glow of a lamp spilled into the room. Shadows moved inside. And then he saw her. Margaret, standing tall in the sitting room, hands resting on the radio, face calm. But Margaret was sitting beside him, trembling in his chair. Collins's breath caught in his throat. "Dear God." The Margaret in the window lifted her head slowly, as if aware she was being watched. Her lips moved. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read them clearly. "I'm home." The real Margaret buried her face in her hands, weeping. "It's finished, isn't it?" "It's already taken me." Collins shook his head violently. "No, that thing in there isn't you. It's a copy, a lure. It wants us to believe." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed himself. They watched in silence as the double reached forward and turned the radio's dial with a delicate twist of her fingers. The glow of the lamp flickered. And across the street, Collins's tape recorder clicked on again, though neither of them had touched it. From the speaker came Margaret's voice, smooth and steady. "Don't trust her. I'm the real one." Collins slammed the machine off, his skin crawling. The Margaret in his chair sobbed harder, whispering, "That's not me. Please, believe me." But the doubt had already taken root. Collins couldn't shake the image. Margaret's double standing calm in her sitting room, while the real woman trembled beside him. By morning, he'd made up his mind. If it's just a copy, he said, then we'll prove it. We'll go in there together. We'll see which of you belongs. Margaret begged him not to. It wants you inside, don't you understand? That's why it showed you. But Collins was stubborn. Better to face it than let it spread. That evening, just before dusk, they crossed the street together. The house looked the same as always. Curtains drawn, chimney still, front door locked. Too normal, too silent. Collins slid the spare key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. He tried again, harder. Nothing. He cursed, ramming his shoulder into the door. It didn't budge. "Step aside," he growled, hauling a crowbar from his bag. He wedged it between the door and frame, leaning with all his weight. The wood groaned but didn't break. When he pulled back, panting, Margaret whispered, "It doesn't want you in." They circled to the back, tried the kitchen door, then the windows. Every latch refused to move. Every pane felt fused to the frame, as if the glass had melted into the wood. When Collins struck a window with the crowbar, it didn't shatter. The glass rippled like water, then stilled again. From inside, the lamp flickered on. Through the warped glass, Margaret's double appeared once more. She walked slowly to the window, her face serene, her eyes fixed on Collins. Her lips moved. He couldn't hear her through the sealed pane, but the words were clear. "Let me out," Margaret screamed, clutching Collins's coat. "That's not me! Don't listen!" The double placed her palm flat against the inside of the glass, and from within the wall around the window came the faintest sound. A heartbeat, steady, patient. Collins staggered back, horror in his eyes. The whole house was alive, not just haunted, living, and it was keeping the copy safe inside, as though guarding something precious. That night, they retreated to his home again. But at 2:00 a.m., the radio across the street crackled to life. Through the static, Arthur's voice whispered, "One Margaret will stay. The other will answer. The wall will decide." Collins was restless, pacing his living room like a man trapped in a shrinking cage. Margaret sat hunched in his armchair, staring at the carpet, whispering to herself, "Don't answer. Don't answer." By dusk, Collins snapped. "If it won't let us inside, we'll make it speak out here. Machines don't lie." He carried 3 recorders across the street and set them in the snow, one by the front door, one beneath the sitting room window, and one on the porch railing. Margaret refused to follow. She stood shivering at the curb, clutching her shawl, her eyes fixed on the drawn curtains. At 2:00 a.m., all 3 machines clicked on together. Static bled into the night. Arthur's voice drifted through, soft and coaxing. "Margaret, I'm waiting." The house lights flickered once, though no electricity was connected. Then came another voice layered beneath Arthur's. Margaret's voice. But from where? She sat only 20 feet away, shaking her head violently. "I'll come." Her knees buckled. "No," she whispered. "That isn't me. That isn't me." Collins ran forward and snatched up the recorder by the window. The reels spun furiously, faster than his model could allow. From the speaker, 2 voices emerged now, both Margaret's. One trembling, desperate. "Don't answer!" The other calm, steady, commanding, "Answer again." The voices overlapped, echoing through the snowy street like 2 halves of the same throat. Margaret collapsed into the snow, covering her ears. "It's already decided. It doesn't need me anymore." Collins grabbed her shoulders. "No, you're the real one. That thing in there is a shadow. Don't let it convince you otherwise." But even as he spoke, the recorder screeched. The reels locked, tape twisting and snapping. And for a heartbeat, over the static, both Margarets spoke in unison. "Only one of us will remain." The recorder fell silent. The house across the street went dark. Margaret wept into her hands. Collins, pale and trembling, whispered the truth neither wanted to face. "It's not a haunting anymore. It's a replacement." Collins had stopped sleeping. His face was hollow, his hands unsteady, but his determination burned hotter than his fear. "If the front won't open," he told Margaret, "we'll try below. No house seals the ground completely." Margaret clutched his sleeve, begging him not to. "Arthur told me never to answer, and you're about to walk straight into its mouth." But Collins only shook her off. "Better I go than let it finish you." The following night, he carried a lantern and crowbar across the snowy street. Margaret refused to follow, but she watched from his porch, her eyes wide and glassy. Behind her, the radio in his living room began to hum. The storm doors to the basement were rusted, frozen in place. Collins jammed the crowbar beneath them and heaved until the hinges screamed and the wood splintered. A bitter wind rose from the dark below, not cold but damp, thick with the smell of mildew and something coppery. He lowered himself down the steps, lantern swinging in his hand. The basement walls dripped with condensation. The stone foundation should have been solid, but as the light passed, Collins saw them ripple faintly, like skin beneath water. He pressed the lantern closer. The mortar between the stones pulsed. He staggered back, choking. The entire wall beat, slow and steady, in rhythm with a heart too large to belong to anything human. Then came the voices. Not from the radio above, from the basement itself. Dozens, hundreds, layered together in the dark, whispering through the wet stone. "We are here. We are waiting. We are almost her." Collins raised the crowbar, his voice breaking. "What do you want from her?" The wall shivered. A face pressed outward, slick and pale, features half-formed, not Arthur's, Margaret's. Her mouth opened. Her voice poured out, "To finish." The lantern flickered. Shadows twisted along the wall like veins. Collins stumbled backward up the stairs, gagging on the damp air, slamming the doors shut behind him. From the porch across the street, Margaret screamed his name. He staggered toward her, pale as death, his clothes stinking of wet stone. "Your house," he rasped. "It isn't wood and brick anymore. It's becoming you." That night, at 2 a.m., the radio clicked on in Collins's own house for the first time. From the speaker came Margaret's voice, but it wasn't the trembling widow's voice beside him. It was the other one, calm, certain. "I'm ready." The next day, Collins barely spoke. His face was pale, his eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. Margaret sat in his armchair, shivering, clutching her shawl. Neither mentioned what the radio in his house had played the night before. Neither dared. But by evening, the whispers had spread beyond them. At dusk, Mrs. Everett from 3 doors down knocked on Collins's door, her hands trembling. "Something's wrong with my radio," she whispered. "I heard voices. My husband's been dead 10 years, but last night—" She broke off, covering her mouth. Behind her, a boy from the corner house called nervously, "It happened to ours, too. The TV. It spoke my name." Soon more neighbors gathered, pale and frantic. Each one had the same story, voices whispering through their machines, static at exactly 2 a.m., and more than one swore they heard Margaret's name. Collins's blood ran cold. "This isn't a haunting anymore," he muttered. "It's a broadcast." Margaret collapsed against the wall, whispering, "It's using me to spread." That night, the entire street fell silent before the hour. Curtains drawn. Lights out. Radios unplugged, televisions off, plugs pulled from the walls. Still, at 2 o'clock a.m., every house filled with static. Neighbors heard it through heaters, fans, the hum of refrigerators, the whisper threading itself through anything that carried a current, and the words were the same across every home. Arthur's voice, calm, certain. She answered me. She belongs to us now. And so do you. In Collins's house, the sound was deafening. His recorder clicked on without his touch. On the tape, they heard Margaret's voice. Not the woman sobbing in the chair, but the other one. Closer, closer, closer. The next morning, neighbors refused to speak to Margaret. Some wouldn't meet her eyes at all. One woman hissed, "You brought this on us." Margaret sank into Collins's chair, shaking uncontrollably. "It's already finished with me. Now it's feeding on everyone else." Collins paced the room, gripping his head. But then he froze. Because faintly, beneath the hum of his own refrigerator, a new whisper curled through the air. Not finished. Never finished. The neighborhood was unraveling. 2 families packed their cars and left before dawn. Others nailed blankets over their televisions, cut their wires, buried radios in the yard. None of it helped. The voices always found another way through. By mid-morning, Collins sat at his kitchen table with his head in his hands. Margaret sat opposite him, pale, her teacup untouched. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, hard. "We burn it. We burn your house down to the ground." Margaret froze. She shook her head violently. "No. You don't understand. I tried to destroy the radio. It came back. The house isn't just walls anymore, it's part of them. Fire won't end it. It'll open it." Collins slammed his fist on the table. "Then we open it. Better a flood than this slow drowning. Better ash than a voice in every home." Margaret's lip trembled. "Arthur warned me, don't answer. But I did. If we break the house, we might be breaking the last door that holds them back." That night, Collins gathered fuel cans from his shed. He stacked them in his living room like weapons, his jaw set grim. Margaret wept as she watched him work. "You'll only make it worse." Collins snapped. "It's already worse." At 2 a.m., the street again filled with static. This time, though, it wasn't Arthur's voice. It was Margaret's double, smooth and serene, broadcast through every home. "Don't burn us. If you burn us, you burn her too." Neighbors slammed their windows shut, but the voice crept through anyway, softer than breath, curling in the wires, the drains, even in the silence between heartbeats. Collins rose, trembling with fury. He grabbed one of the cans, yanked the cap loose. "Tomorrow night," he hissed. "We end it." Margaret clutched his sleeve, her nails biting into his arm. "Collins, listen to me. They don't fear fire. They want it." The next morning, he crossed the street to her house to scout where to pour the fuel. The curtains twitched as he approached. Through the glass, Margaret's double smiled at him. Her lips moved slowly, clearly. "Light the match." The following night, the neighborhood held its breath. Curtains stayed shut, lights dim, as if everyone sensed something was about to happen. Collins dragged the fuel cans across Blackthorn Lane, his jaw set, his face hollow with sleepless rage. Margaret followed reluctantly, whispering prayers, begging him to stop, but he was beyond stopping. "If this is a nest," he growled, splashing fuel across the porch and up the walls, "then we burn the nest, even if it burns us too." The smell of gasoline spread thick in the air. Collins struck a match, the flame trembling in the winter wind. Margaret screamed, "Don't!" But he dropped it anyway. The porch erupted in fire, flames crawling eagerly up the wood. For a heartbeat, relief surged in him. He expected smoke, collapse, destruction. Instead, the fire twisted. The flames bent sideways, curling against the wind, drawing inward into the walls. Not spreading, not consuming, feeding. The fire burned in spirals, forming shapes across the siding, sigils, faces, mouths opening in silent screams. The entire house glowed from within, as if veins of fire pulsed through its bones. Margaret fell to her knees, wailing. "I told you, they wanted this!" Colin stumbled back, eyes wide in horror. "It's not burning." The fire didn't weaken the structure. It strengthened it. The house stood straighter, its walls flexing as if taking a deeper breath. And from inside, the flames came a voice, smooth and serene. Margaret's voice. "Thank you, Collins." The neighbors poured into the street, gasping, clutching their children. They watched as the flames sank into the walls, leaving the wood unscorched. Within minutes, the fire was gone. Not extinguished, consumed. The house stood pristine, untouched, but different, taller, darker. Its windows looked like eyes. At 2:00 a.m., every radio in the neighborhood clicked on at once. Arthur's voice boomed, layered now with Margaret's. "The fire has fed us. The door is wide." And from the walls of Margaret's house came a deep, resonant sound. A heartbeat. After the fire, no one slept. Families huddled together in their living rooms, radios unplugged, televisions wrapped in blankets. But still, the static crept in. From heaters, from fans, even from the hum of power lines outside. And always, at 2:00 a.m., the voices rose. On the night of December 14th, it grew worse. Mrs. Everett's boy screamed. Neighbors rushed outside in time to see him pounding against the siding of his own house, begging his mother to let him out. But he wasn't inside. He was already halfway into the wall, his body dissolving into plaster like wet paint. By the time she reached him, only his hand remained, pressed flat against the siding. It sank slowly, and then was gone. Word spread fast. Some tried to flee, but the further they drove, the louder the static grew on their car radios. One family abandoned their vehicle altogether, swearing the voice of their dead daughter had spoken from the engine itself. By morning, 3 houses stood silent and empty, curtains drawn, families gone. Neighbors whispered they hadn't left. They had moved inside. Collins paced his living room like a caged man. Margaret sat motionless in his chair, her hands locked in prayer. "They're not confined to you anymore," he said. "Your house was just the first door. Now every house on this street is a door." Margaret lifted her pale face, tears shining in her eyes. "Arthur tried to warn me. If I answered, it wouldn't stop with me." Her voice cracked. "I answered, Collins." "I answered?" That night, the neighborhood gathered in the street, desperate. They formed a circle of lanterns, children pressed into their parents' arms, all eyes fixed on Margaret's dark, waiting house. At 2:00 a.m., every lantern guttered out. From every wall on the street came a sound, slow, steady, impossible to mistake. Knocking. 3 taps, answered by 3 more. Dozens of houses knocking to one another in unison, as though the entire neighborhood had joined the chorus. Margaret collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "It isn't my house anymore. It's all of them." Collins pulled her up, his voice hoarse. "Then there's nowhere left to run." Collins couldn't watch another family vanish into plaster. He made up his mind. Margaret had to leave. "Pack nothing," he told her. "We go tonight. No more waiting, no more listening." Margaret looked hollow, her eyes red from weeping. "Collins, if the voices are already everywhere, where can we go?" "Anywhere but here," he said firmly. At midnight, he led her down Blackthorn Lane. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, but didn't step out to stop them. The two of them looked like fugitives fleeing a battlefield. They cut across the fields, away from the houses, away from the lights. The cold grass crunched underfoot, the sky wide and silent above them. For the first time in weeks, Margaret thought, here we'll be free. But at 2 a.m., the silence broke. The wind carried static, not from a machine, from the air itself. A hiss threaded through the dark, rising from the frozen ground, curling in the bare branches of the trees. Then the voices came. Arthur's first. "Margaret, come home." Then the chorus, dozens, hundreds, rolling across the fields like a tide. "In the walls, in the air, always here." Collins pulled Margaret to her knees. "Don't listen. Don't answer." But she was trembling violently, her lips moving, forming words even as she fought to keep them in. Her own voice whispered back to the sky, "Where are you?" The static deepened. The earth beneath them shivered. All around, the dark fields rippled like a vast sheet of fabric. Shapes pressed upward from beneath the soil, hands, faces, outlines of bodies straining to break through. Margaret screamed. Collins dragged her, half carrying her toward the distant road. But wherever they ran, the ground rippled with those shapes, pressing upward, whispering her name. At last they collapsed on the roadside, gasping. The field behind them stilled. Collins looked into Margaret's face, pale, lips bloodless, her eyes glassy. She whispered, barely audible, "They're not in the walls anymore. I am." They stumbled back to Blackthorn Lane just before dawn, exhausted and shivering from the long night in the fields. But the street they returned to was not the one they had left. Every other house stood silent, curtains drawn, no smoke rising from chimneys, not silence of sleep, silence of absence. Collins led Margaret up the street, knocking on doors, calling names. No answer. When he forced open the Everett's front door, the hallway smelled of dust and emptiness. The kitchen table was bare. The family portraits were gone. Even the carpet looked untouched, as though no one had ever walked on it. Margaret clung to his arm, her voice breaking. "It's like they were never here." In the Miller's house, the wallpaper was fresh and clean, no scuffs from years of children's hands. The closets hung empty, the entire family of 5 erased in a single night. By mid-morning, Collins realized the pattern. Every other house on the street had been hollowed out. Half the neighbors gone, half still there. But the ones who remained looked changed. Through cracked curtains, he saw faces staring blankly back. Neighbors who had once spoken, now silent, their eyes glassy. When Mrs. Patterson shuffled into her yard, she only whispered a single word over and over, her voice like static. "Closer." Collins dragged Margaret back into his own home, bolting the door. "They're not just vanishing," he whispered. "They're rewriting, removing entire lives, like they were never here at all." Margaret sat at his table, her hands trembling violently. "That's what Arthur meant. It's not haunting us. It's replacing us." At 2 a.m., the radio in Collins's house clicked on again. Not Arthur this time, not Margaret's double, but dozens of voices layered together, speaking as one. "Half taken, half remain. Soon all will be inside." The walls of Collins's living room pulsed with the sound. Margaret covered her ears, sobbing, "It's not stopping. It's finishing." Collins had always believed in action. When a roof leaked, you patched it. When a pipe burst, you shut the valve. When something broke, you fixed it. But this couldn't be patched, couldn't be nailed down. Still, he couldn't do nothing. At dawn, he pulled Margaret into his kitchen. "We call outside town, police, Fire. Someone. They can't ignore us all. Margaret's hands shook as she clutched her shawl. Collins, the voices are everywhere. They'll hear too. He slammed the receiver of his landline down anyway. The dial tone purred, steady. He dialed the county sheriff's office. The line rang once, twice. Then it crackled. Static filled the receiver, hissing into his ear. And over it came Arthur's voice, calm and near. You don't need to call. We're already here. Collins dropped the receiver like it burned him. It swung on the cord, tapping against the wall. Margaret backed away, whispering, I told you. The lines are walls too. Collins wasn't done. He marched Margaret across the street to the Patterson house, one of the last families left. Inside, the husband sat at the kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear. His wife hovered nearby, pale and rigid. Did you reach anyone? Collins asked. The man's eyes flicked up, glassy. He nodded slowly, lips trembling. Yes, I spoke to my brother in the city. But his wife shook her head violently, clutching his arm. No, you didn't. You never called. You've been listening. The man's grip on the phone tightened. From the receiver came a low whisper, faint but clear. Closer. By nightfall, most of the remaining neighbors had smashed their phones. Some burned the cords in their yards, but it didn't matter. At 2:00 a.m., every broken receiver rang at once, shrill and furious, though none were plugged into the wall. Collins and Margaret sat frozen in his kitchen, listening as the ringing filled the street like church bells. Then, all at once, it stopped. And a single phrase whispered through every house on Blackthorn Lane. Soon you won't need to call us. You'll be with us. Collins had had enough. If we can't call for help, then we drive, he told Margaret the next morning, his voice sharp with determination. We don't stop until we see the county line. No walls, no voices, just open road. Margaret shook her head weakly. You don't understand, Collins. They aren't inside the walls anymore. The walls are everywhere. But he refused to listen. By nightfall, he had packed his truck with food, water, and blankets. Margaret sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands twisting her shawl until the fabric threatened to tear. They drove down Blackthorn Lane, past the silent, half-empty houses. The street stretched into dark forest, headlights cutting tunnels through the cold air. For a while, Margaret dared to believe. The voices were silent. The air was still. The town was behind them. But 20 minutes later, Collins slammed the brakes. Ahead of them, illuminated in the headlights, was the wooden sign at the bend of Blackthorn Lane. Welcome to Blackthorn Lane. They had looped back. No, Collins hissed, slamming the wheel. He spun the truck around, flooring the accelerator. They roared down another road, faster this time, ignoring intersections, ignoring familiar landmarks. But half an hour later, the headlights caught the same sign again. Welcome to Blackthorn Lane. Margaret whimpered. I told you. The town is already inside them. You can't leave because there is no outside anymore. Collins pounded the steering wheel, furious. It's a trick, a maze. We'll break through if we keep going. But as the night deepened, the roads twisted back on themselves again and again. Every path, every turn, led back to the same sign. Welcome to Blackthorn Lane. At 2:00 a.m., the truck's engine sputtered and died. Collins cursed, slamming the ignition again and again, but the key refused to turn. The headlights dimmed. The cab filled with static, not from the radio, but from the air itself. And Arthur's voice whispered from every direction at once. You cannot leave the walls, Collins. because you are already inside them. The windshield fogged, shapes pressed against the glass from the outside, pale hands smearing downward, dozens of them, faces leaned close, features half-formed, mouths whispering silently. Margaret clutched Collins's arm, tears streaking her cheeks. They don't want us to escape. They want us to join. The truck never restarted. By dawn, Collins and Margaret abandoned it on the roadside, trudging back toward town in silence. But the town they returned to was not the one they left. Blackthorn Lane looked smaller, narrower, as if the street had been compressed. Half the houses were gone, erased entirely, leaving gaps filled with empty lots of bare dirt. The remaining homes leaned inward like watchers, and at the center stood Margaret's house. It was no longer a modest cottage. The roof line had stretched higher, its walls impossibly tall. The windows gaped like black eyes, unshuttered, unblinking. The siding had darkened to the color of wet stone, veins of red seared across its surface like scars. Where the front porch had once been stood an archway that pulsed faintly, as though breathing. Margaret stopped dead, her hands flying to her mouth. It's grown. Collins swallowed hard. No. It's becoming. As they stood in horror, the neighbors emerged from their homes. Silent, glassy-eyed, they drifted into the street, gathering before Margaret's house. Their faces were blank, their movements synchronized, like a congregation answering a call. Not one of them looked at Collins. Every gaze was fixed on the towering house. At 2:00 a.m., the archway glowed faintly, lit from within by a fire that wasn't fire. The structure vibrated with a low hum, deep enough to rattle the bones in Collins's chest. The neighbors dropped to their knees as one, bowing their heads. From the black windows came Margaret's double, her face serene, her movements graceful. She stood in the archway, hands folded in front of her. Her voice poured across the street, amplified by the house itself. "The door is wide. Come closer." Collins turned to Margaret, the real one, who clutched his sleeve in terror. "She's not your shadow anymore," he whispered. "She's your replacement." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming. "No, she's my end." The house pulsed again, and for a moment Collins swore it wasn't a house at all. It was a chest rising, a throat opening, a body waiting to swallow them whole. Collins pulled Margaret back, away from the gathering crowd. "Don't look at it. Don't listen." But Margaret wasn't fighting him anymore. She was trembling, her eyes glazed as though something else had rooted inside her. From the archway, the double's calm voice rang out again. "Come closer, Margaret." Margaret flinched as if struck. Collins tightened his grip. "Ignore it." Her lips quivered. "It's not her voice I hear, Collins. It's mine." She pressed her palms over her ears, shaking violently. "Inside my head, it's me. I'm calling myself. I'm telling myself to walk into that door." Her knees buckled. Collins caught her before she fell. "Fight it," he begged. "That thing in there isn't you." Her eyes filled with tears. "But it is. That's the worst part. It doesn't sound wrong. It sounds like what I've always wanted to say." From the street, the neighbors began to chant softly, a single word in unison. "Closer, closer, closer." The sound rattled like waves on a shore, growing louder, sinking with the pulse of the house. Margaret clawed at her own shawl, whispering, "If I go inside, maybe it stops. Maybe everyone is freed." Collins gripped her shoulders, furious. "No, that's what it wants. It won't stop. It'll spread farther. You'll only be the first brick in a higher wall." At 2:00 a.m., the archway opened wider. Light, Not fire, but something white and liquid poured outward like a flood. Margaret's double stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Collins now. And then, in Margaret's own voice, inside his skull, came a whisper. "Let me go, Collins, please. It's the only way." He staggered, releasing her for just a second. In that instant, Margaret lurched toward the archway, as though drawn by invisible hands. Collins grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. But the crowd of neighbors turned in unison, their blank faces all fixed on him, their voices rising together like a storm. "Do not hold her back!" Collins clung to Margaret's wrist with all his strength, pulling her back from the archway's glow. Her body trembled, torn between him and the pull of the house, her voice caught in a strangled sob. The neighbor's chant rose louder, pressing against his skull like a physical weight. "Do not hold her back! Do not hold her back!" Then Collins froze, because in the crowd of kneeling neighbors he saw her. Margaret, not the double in the archway, but another one, standing barefoot in the snow, her shawl wrapped neatly around her shoulders. Her expression was calm, her movements steady. She walked through the congregation, and not a single person seemed to notice. Collins whispered hoarsely, "God help us. She's already out here." The double moved closer, her bare feet leaving no prints in the frost. She stopped just beyond the lantern light, her serene gaze fixed on Margaret. The real Margaret, shivering in his grip. Her voice rang out, soft but unshakable. "You don't belong with him. You belong with us." Margaret wailed, covering her face. "It's me. Collins, it's me." I can feel her speaking my thoughts before I have them. Collins stepped in front of her, raising the crowbar he still carried. "Stay back," he snarled. The double only smiled. Her outline shimmered faintly, as if her body were both there and not. And then, impossibly, the crowd of neighbors shifted. Half of them now wore Margaret's face. Collins's knees weakened. The street was filled with dozens of her, silent, staring, whispering the same words in perfect unison. "Closer, closer, closer." Margaret screamed, collapsing against him, her body shaking violently. "I can't tell anymore which one is me." At 2:00 a.m., the archway flared with blinding light. The Margarets in the crowd raised their hands together, their voices merging with the hum of the house, and the double in front of them spoke with Arthur's voice now, deep and commanding. "The time has come. She will step inside." The street was no longer a street. The houses leaned inward, their windows glowing like watchful eyes. The neighbors knelt in rows, half of them wearing Margaret's face, all whispering the same word in unison. "Closer, closer, closer." At the center, her house pulsed like a living monument, the archway spilling liquid light into the night. Collins gripped Margaret's arm with both hands. "Don't do this. If you step inside, I'll lose you. We'll all lose you." Her tear-streaked face turned to him, hollow with exhaustion. "Collins, I've already lost myself. She's in me. She's me. If I don't go, they'll take everyone else." The double in the archway smiled serenely, her hand outstretched, and Margaret's own voice whispered inside her head, soft as prayer. "Come home." Collins shook her violently. "You are real. Your flesh, your blood. That thing is nothing but an echo." But Margaret leaned closer, whispering, "And what if the echo is louder than me?" At 2:00 a.m., the archway widened. The glow washed across the street, pulling the breath from every chest. The crowd bowed lower. The air vibrated with Arthur's voice layered over Margaret's, a perfect harmony. "Step inside. The wall is wide." Margaret turned to Collins, her eyes steady for the first time in weeks. "Don't stop me," she whispered. If you love me, don't stop me. Collins's grip faltered. His heart broke. And in that instant, she wrenched free. She walked barefoot across the frozen ground, her shawl trailing like a shroud. The neighbors parted for her, bowing as she passed. At the archway, her double took her hand. The two Margarets looked at each other, identical, lips moving together in perfect sync. I am home. They stepped forward into the light. Collins screamed her name and surged after her, but as he reached the threshold, the archway slammed shut with a sound like stone grinding against stone. The house went dark. The neighbors lifted their heads as one, their voices echoing into the silence. It is finished. Collins collapsed in the snow, clawing at the earth, howling her name into the night. But Margaret was gone. Only the radio on his kitchen table remained, silent for the first time, until, a week later, at exactly 2:00 a.m., it crackled to life again. Collins pressed his ear close, his face hollow, desperate. And from the static came her voice, Margaret's, calm and steady. I'm still here, Collins. Step inside.